I remember the weight of that paper more clearly than anything else. The thin, clinical page that held the verdict on my life with her. Evelyn's diagnosis, stage 5. The words sat there on the glossy hospital letterhead, like a verdict I couldn't appeal. I stood in the doorway of Marcus's high-rise apartment. The report crumpled in my fist until the edges bit my palm. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows the city glittered, all glass and chrome and a kind of hard, prosperous light that belonged to people who had learned how to look away. Inside, Marcus lounged on a leather sofa like a man who'd never had to worry about money. He scrolled through his phone, thumbs moving with the calm indifference of someone who believed his life would always be uncomplicated. Beside him, Claire, my daughter, toyed with a gold bracelet, turning it so the light caught its facets. Her laugh had the same surface polish as the apartment. It bounced off the stainless steel and died on the coffee table. I had come to them with one small thing: hope, or at least the chance of it. The treatment was expensive, borderline absurd on paper, and the statistics were thin as tissue, but it was something. It was a shot. I told them the cost. I told them how small the window was, how quickly those slimmest chances evaporated. My throat tightened and my voice broke on the words because I could feel Evelyn at home, asleep in the next town over, breathing like a person who still had mornings to plan. "Please," I said. "It's your mother." Marcus snorted without looking up. "It's your problem, Dad." The words were casual, practiced, delivered with the smoothness of someone who closed deals for a living and who knew how to deflect responsibility with a half-smile. Claire didn't even bother to look at me. She gave a tiny, almost bored nod and went back to tracing the bracelet's pattern with her fingernail. Her voice when she did speak was soft and perfectly measured. "We can't afford it, Dad. You know that." Those sentences, the refusal, the dismissal, landed on me like blows. I thought of every scholarship check, every second shift, every holiday I'd worked instead of taking them away. I remembered standing at graduation ceremonies with papers and pride, signing off on loans for first apartments, tucking envelopes into hands on birthdays. I had built the scaffolding of their comfortable lives out of the kind of sacrifices that leave you exhausted and satisfied in equal measure. And now, faced with a single sheet of paper, they treated the love that had raised them as if it had been cheap insurance. I stepped forward. The medical report felt absurd in my hand, fragile as a confession. "She would do anything for you," I said. The words sounded ridiculous in the bright, tasteful room. They should have been enough. They were not. Marcus pushed the paper with a single finger as if it were garbage. "You think I'm dipping into my savings for this? Get real." There was no heat, no struggle, just business-like dismissal. Claire's gaze slid past me to the skyline. Her reflection doubled in the glass. "We've got our own lives," she said finally. "You made your choices." It was a phrase I'd heard before, but never with so much finality. I left the report on the glass table. It made a soft, hollow thud that sounded obscene in the space between us. I could have tried to shame them, to raise my voice and brandish memory after memory of the nights I'd stayed late at work so they could go on trips, the times I'd eaten leftover rice while they ate out. Instead, an emptiness opened in me, a hollow that was colder than anger, a calcified hurt that felt like betrayal. Their faces were closed, polite, and utterly indifferent. When I turned to go, Marcus slid his phone into his pocket, and Claire went back to the window. The door closed behind me like a verdict. They didn't come to Evelyn's funeral. They sent one small neat bouquet that looked like something from a corporate catalog, and no one to stand in the wind while I said the words that mattered. On the day of the service the church felt too big, and the chairs too empty. The pastor's voice echoed off the rafters, while I watched faces that had loved her bend and weep. My heart felt hollow in a way that wasn't entirely from grief. It was a new furious ache that shimmered with the knowledge of how casually they'd walked away from her. After the burial I sat in the car, watching them go down the lane, heads bowed, and felt nothing when the engine started without them. That night, in the small kitchen of the house that had been ours for 30 years, I spread Evelyn's quilt across the table and sat alone. The coffee had gone cold in the pot. The house smelled faintly of her, lavender and lemon and the book pages she'd carried like talismans. I tiptoed past her bedroom. She slept with the same soft exhalations she always had, unaware that the world had tilted, and that I knew the reason why. I couldn't tell her then. I couldn't let the last thing she held on to be the truth that our children had turned away. I am not a vengeful man by instinct. I have no taste for violence, and I am not interested in blood. But betrayal has a way of sharpening a man's mind. It's a corrosive thing that eats at bone until all you are left with is a single precise need: justice. I stood in that kitchen and swore softly, the vow almost ridiculous in the quiet, not to destroy them with brute force, but to let their indifference be answered in kind, to make them feel the solitude they had given us, not to ruin them outright, but to strip away the comforts their lives had been built on, to make every tidy advance and easy grin cost them something real. The plan, such as I had at first, was not elaborate. It was, at its root, patient and exacting. I would expose pieces of them to consequences they had never imagined. I would take the things they considered secure and make them precarious. I would not spill blood. I would reclaim what they had denied. The thought settled into me like a stone finding its place at the bottom of a lake. Once there, it would not move. I folded the report and smoothed it flat on the table, tracing the hospital letterhead with a finger as if I could read a different answer into it. Outside, the city lights flickered like indifferent stars. Inside, under Evelyn's quilt, the house hummed with the memory of a life we had shared. I breathed in that lavender scent, and let the vow come into focus. They would understand what abandonment felt like. They would learn in ways that mattered, that some debts are not paid with money alone. I sat at the kitchen table long after the house had quieted into that particular kind of night hush that seems to make every problem louder. The lamp over the sink threw a pool of yellow light across the scarred wood, and the medical report lay beside my coffee like an accusation. I picked up the receiver and dialed the bank. "Hello, this is Henry," I said, "because sometimes speaking your own name steadies you. I need a loan." My voice was steadier than I felt. The steadiness was deliberate. The clerk's questions came in a polite, mechanical torrent. Collateral, income, outstanding debts. I answered like a man listing what he'd already lost. The house, the small pensions, the careful stock of memories that never seemed to count for anything on paper. We had nothing flashy, only years of thrift and a car I'd babied through winters. It was enough for something, if I had to make it enough. Next, I called the dealer. I lied about the car the way men lie to themselves. "It's old, but it runs fine." I could see the sedan in my mind. Picture the dent by the passenger door from the time we scraped the mailbox. Remember the smell of coffee and wet wool from the night we drove Laura home after graduation. I told the dealer the truth in pieces and kept the best parts for myself. By dawn, I had arranged to empty our retirement account. Every cent we'd tucked away like a secret for rainier days. It wouldn't cover the full treatment, but it would buy a thread of hope. It was something I could do, something I had to do. My back ached and my eyes burned from 2 nights' sleep at most. But movement is its own kind of medicine. The errands blurred into one another. Bank counters, the dealer's lot, calls to insurers that ended with polite refusals. I felt like a man carrying a map with pieces torn out. Still, every trip got me closer to the hospital, where Evelyn waited, fragile and patient as glass. Hospitals have their own smell: antiseptic and lemon-scented hand gel, recycled air that smells faintly of everyone who has ever been ill. I walked into that world with all of my small sacrifices embarrassed and visible. Evelyn lay in a narrow bed, the hospital gown bunched at her shoulder, her hair in a careless knot. Her face was paler than it used to be. But when she saw me, a smile, small and loyal, shaped itself anyway. "You look tired, Henry," she said, and the tenderness in it made me think of long-ago mornings and fresh-baked bread. "I'm fine," I answered, and the lie was warm and immediate in my mouth. I sat and forced the grin because that was my role, the one I had played for 40 years, the holder of small comforts, the fixer of skinned knees. Her hand found mine, thin cartilage against bone, and the weight of the gold on her finger. Our ring was a shock of memory. The day I slid it onto her hand felt like an entire life ago, when promises seemed smaller and therefore easier to keep. I wanted to tell her everything. The dealer, the bank, the way our savings had been folded into envelopes like confessionals. I wanted to confess that our children, Marcus and Claire, had turned away. But I couldn't bear the look that would come after the truth, the way her eyes might find pity or worse, the knowledge that she'd been abandoned when she needed them most. So I lied. They send their love, I said. And she nodded, trusting me with a trust so complete, it landed like a small, unbearable weight on my chest. I hated myself for it and loved myself for it in the same breath. Later the doctor asked me to step into the corridor. He had tired lines around his mouth, and a clipboard that seemed too small to hold the enormity of what he wanted to say. "A month, maybe 2, he said, and his voice was steady but hollow. "The treatment might buy time. It's not a cure." He didn't have to finish. The numbers were a kind of arithmetic I already knew. Probabilities, fractions, the little sliver of chance you could hold in your hands if you could make the whole world fold the right way. I paid what I could. Some days the payments felt like pinpricks on a map, each tiny withdrawal a little geography of loss. Days narrowed into lists: bank, pharmacy, hospital. Call the social worker, sit. I sat with Evelyn and told her stories from our early years, how we once got lost driving to a summer house and ended up laughing all night in a field, how she taught me to prune roses, anything to keep her tethered to the living. Her smiles grew rarer, but each one was luminous, like small signals in the dark. One night the monitor beside her bed changed its rhythm. The beep that had been a steady, indifferent metronome slowed and then stumbled. Evelyn's breaths came shallow and spaced further apart. I clutched her hand until my knuckles whitened. Her wedding ring, heavy with years and memory, felt cold against my palm. "Stay with me," I whispered, though there was nothing that could bargain with time. The flat line came like a small, obscene punctuation. The room condensed into a hard pinprick of sound, the exhalation that was no longer hers. I did not cry in that moment. The feeling there was finer and sharper than grief at first, a burning, precise edge of fury that cut away sentiment and left only a vow. Marcus and Claire had not called. They had not come. They had left her in the small hours to face the vastness alone while we scraped and pleaded. I folded Evelyn's hand in mine, as if I could close the gap, and slid her ring into my pocket. The metal was cold and real, and suddenly became an instrument, not of harm, but of reckoning. I would carry it as a reminder of what I had lost and what they would be made to lose. At the cemetery the rain seemed to collect like witnesses. Drops dotted the polished wood of her casket, and the priest's words blurred into a sound like wind. Under the shovel's rhythmic scrape, I watched the empty chairs under the tent where family should have been. No Marcus, no Claire, not a call, not a message. The sky was the color of old photographs. The drive home afterwards was dumb and silent. The house held its breath without Evelyn's hum filling the rooms. I found the photo albums and opened them like a man opening a ledger. The anger that rose then was not an animal roar, but the cold calculation of someone who had seen a moral balance tip and knew how to set it right. I had promised myself I would not take blood. I had promised I would not become a monster. But I had also promised Evelyn that I would protect what was hers. And when those who called themselves her children turned away, I decided to answer with the one language they understood: consequence. I sat at the table, the ring in my pocket a heavy and honest thing, and began to plan, not with the heat of revenge, but with the steady patience of someone who had always been a saver, a planner, a man who measured twice and cut once. I would not destroy Marcus and Claire. I would not scream at them into ruin. I would remove the scaffolding under their comfortable lives, piece by piece, in ways that would make them understand the cost of walking away. The vow that had lodged like a stone in my chest was now a blueprint. I would teach them the price of indifference. I hadn't touched that album in years. The leather had gone soft where my thumb had rubbed it raw. The spine sighed when I opened it, and the pages unfurled with the small shivery sound of something waking. Pictures spilled across the paper like accusations. There was Marcus grinning in his first car, the used sedan I'd sweated for and surprised him with after another long winter, hair wind-tossed, eyes all boyish mischief. There was Claire in a dress like spun sugar on her wedding day, the grin on her face so wide it seemed to break the frame. We'd mortgaged the house to pay for that reception, and told ourselves proudly that love was worth the ledger's thin red line. Every page was a ledger of years, baseball games and piano recitals, sunburned vacations, scraped knees we'd bandaged with jokes. Each photograph was a small warm proof that we had loved them enough. Now those images felt like evidence in a trial I hadn't asked to be part of. My fingers tightened on the page until the edge bent, the paper creasing like a map I'd no longer trust. How had we arrived here at this cold distance, this casual cruelty? I flipped faster as if speed might stitch the torn thing back together, but the faces blurred into each other. Marcus's graduation, Claire at prom, one riotous Christmas where Evelyn danced in the kitchen with a paper crown on her head. The ache in my chest was not the rawness of grief alone. It had hardened into a steady corrosive burn. Betrayal. When the album slipped from my hands and hit the carpet with a dull thud, the sound struck something in me that had not been heard for a very long time. I stood up, the room tilting for a second, as the full weight of what I'd endured pooled in my feet. Enough, I said aloud to the empty living room, and the word landed like a small decisive hammer. They would pay for this, not with blood. I had sworn that, but with everything they valued. The conviction felt like a new limb. I crossed to the old oak desk, its surface littered with loose receipts and a reading lamp we never replaced, and pulled out my phone. Scrolling through contacts felt like rifling through an old coat. Names I hadn't used in years, favors tucked away like lint. Tom Harlan's name pulsed at the top, a lawyer I'd crossed paths with decades ago when I'd needed help, drawing up a contract for a small storefront I once toyed with buying. People like Tom remember the little debts and the small kindnesses. My thumb hovered, and for once hesitation felt like a thing I could afford to cast aside. The line rang. I didn't talk at first, hearing the static sharpen my purpose. When Tom answered, he was, as always, practical and a touch incredulous. I didn't give him the whole of it, not yet, just enough to get him to listen. He told me to keep my head, to collect names, to document, and pointed me at someone who knew the rumor mill inside Marcus's firm, Susan. So I found myself 2 days later in a corner booth of a crowded cafe, rain streaking the windows into watercolor smears of streetlight. The coffee had gone cold after the third refill. The notebook in front of me had already become a map. Dates, names, questions. When Susan slipped in, dripping and anxious, she looked smaller in the hum of the place. She kept glancing over her shoulder as if everything she said might be recorded by the ceiling. "You shouldn't be here," she mouthed. And then she sat, voice a thread. "Marcus has been bragging about deals that don't exist on any ledger. Off-book money. Fancy phrases. People who aren't on the payroll but are on the invoices." The words came like cigarette smoke. Faint, lingering, enough to make you cough. She told me things in the way people tell secrets that will get them fired if discovered. Whispers of late-night transfers. Lists of names clipped to odd projects. Gestures that didn't add up. I wrote until my hand cramped. Reputation, Tom had said, was Marcus's currency. "If it leaks," Susan murmured, "he's done." That single phrase lodged in me like a seed. Lose the currency, and the man with the suits and the chrome apartment would have to pay in ways he'd not imagined. She left before I could finish pressing her for names, disappearing into the rain with a promise to send what she had. The next stop was Ron, a friend of mine who'd become a lawyer when most of us were still certain the world would afford us mercy. His office was the unglamorous counterpoint to Marcus's high-rise, a cramped room stacked with folders up to the ceiling, the smell of old paper and coffee like absolution. Ron tossed a heavy folder onto the desk and leaned back, tie loose, eyes narrowed. "Marcus is in deep," he said. "The way a surgeon might say, the scan is bad." He laid out the picture: risky investments, partners who'd disappear just before audits, a tangle of liabilities wrapped in confident smiles. "If any regulator pokes, he's got a mess." And Claire, Ron smirked with the cruel amusement of a man holding an open hand of cards. 5 credit cards, missed payments, luxury brands on a thin line. She's been living on borrowed time and borrowed money. When he said her name, I felt it like a personal betrayal again, not because of the numbers, but because of how easily my old kindness had been turned into leverage we were now forced to exploit. Years ago, Claire had come to me for a small loan to start a shop. I'd written her a check with the easy faith of a man who believed in his children. They'd taken my trust and spent it like disposable currency. Now the same trust offered me the means to make them uncomfortable. "What's your play, Henry?" Ron asked, eyes curious, the practiced patience of someone who'd built careers out of other people's crises. For the first time since Evelyn's diagnosis, a plan, not full-formed, but with enough teeth to bite, unrolled in my head. I wasn't going to break them with a single blow. I would engineer discomfort. Public whispers that teased at Marcus's reputation until it frayed, quiet encouragements that made Claire's creditors look closer, and creditors who had once been polite become insistent. I would use the legal tools Ron knew how to wield, and the petty cruelties of a system that punished appearance more than truth. I would not lie, but I would make sure the truth had a louder voice than their polished narratives. I outlined the first steps to Ron in clipped sentences. Gather proof quietly, coax Susan to document what she knew, have Tom check the paper trail for places that would look suspicious to auditors. I wanted discretion, and I wanted it messy enough that Marcus couldn't placate it with charm. Ron listened, nodding in the way a man nods when he recognizes both risk and craftsmanship. "You're not asking me to burn a bridge," he said. "You're asking me to collect dry tinder and let the wind do the rest." That was it. The ethos of what I would do. No arson, only exposure, not blood, but consequence. I tucked Evelyn's ring into my jacket pocket, and felt its cold weight like an oath. My notebook now had a new heading, How to Make Them Notice. Under it, a slow, methodical list of small, humiliating inconveniences that would stack until there was no polite way for them to ignore the absence they had created. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city smelled washed, and for a moment in the hush after the storm, purpose sat in me like a steady warmth. I left Ron's office with a folder of photocopies, and the knowledge that the work ahead would be tedious, surgical and relentless. It would take patience, my old skill, and a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. I would not ruin them in a single night. I would make them reckon with the cost of their indifference, piece by calculated piece. I hadn't opened that album in years. It came alive under my fingers. The spine sighed, the pages exhaled old light. Each photograph was a small accusation. Marcus grinning in his first battered car, Claire radiant and reckless on her wedding day, Evelyn's arms looping around them both as if she could stitch their lives together with nothing but love. I traced the edges of a picture until the paper softened beneath my thumb. Those were the days I'd thought we were invincible. Now the faces looked unfamiliar, gilded and distant, like portraits in a house that rent out its memories. When the album hit the floor with a dull thud, something in me closed. I stood there, breath ragged from more than grief. Betrayal had calcified into purpose. "Enough," I said aloud to the empty room. Not a plea, but a decision, and the word felt like a hinge swinging into place. I was no longer the man who went to work and came home and assumed the world would repair itself. I was a man who had been handed a ledger of debts, and I intended to balance the books. At the desk, I opened my contacts and let my thumb hover over names I used to avoid because favor costs more than you think. Tom Harland, Ron, Susan, all the crumpled little credits and IOUs of a life spent paying forward. I thought of favors owed, of small kindnesses that lived in other people's memories. I dialed, and the ring sounded like possibility. Information is a quiet thing. It arrives in drips and whispers. Susan, tight-lipped and terrified in a cafe booth, handed me those whispers like contraband. Marcus had been glossing over ledgers, slipping things into pockets that didn't belong to him. Claire, my girl who once wanted nothing more than a shop in a little corner of the city, had been living past her means on credit that looked polished on Instagram, but scraped like glass in the morning. Ron confirmed the shape of it. Liabilities wrapped in charm, reputations propped up by mortgage-thin illusions. Each name, each number, each missed payment I wrote down became an arrow pointing back to the two who had walked away from Evelyn when she needed them most. Back home that night, the house wore its grief like a second skin. The single bulb over the sink flickered, and the kitchen felt vast and hollow. I sat with the notebook open, the inked words forming a spiderweb of connections. Marcus, reputation, I wrote, Claire, debts. Lines and arrows crisscrossed until their comfortable lives were a map of their own making. For the first time in months, a small smile found me, not cruel, not celebratory, but clean, the smile of a man who has regained control of at least one thing. I locked the notebook in the drawer. Plans do not thrive in public light, and roused the old laptop from dust. Its keys still stuck a little, but the machine started with a groan, and then settled into a steady hum, like an old dog waking. I pulled up Marcus's firm's website, read the hierarchy, found emails, traced the architecture of their reputations. My fingers hovered over the keys as if pausing could make me less culpable. I typed an anonymous message, with the careful slowness of someone dropping a stone into a pond. You should look into Marcus Collins. Check his deals. The cursor flicked like a heartbeat. I hesitated, tasted the thin metal tang of doubt, felt Evelyn's ring cool against my thigh in my pocket. A cold, honest counterweight. They had left her to die alone. This was not cruelty. It was consequence. I hit send. Once it was gone, the house felt both heavier and quieter. I slept in fits that night, not because I was exhausted, but because the first brick had been set. Morning came gray and sharp. I walked to the park that lives near the downtown, the city's lungs where life goes on in spite of every private tragedy. Joggers pounded past. Dog owners called. A child with a candy floss smile chased pigeons in a ridiculous, beautiful ritual. I sat on a damp bench and let the small churn of the city wash over me. Because you can't plan a campaign in absolute silence, it helps to know that the world still turns. A vendor's radio picked up a headline that made my pulse thud. A local financial firm under scrutiny for irregular transactions. The details were hazy, voices in the ether, but the words lodged in me like a splinter. Marcus's office, glass and steel like a display case, would be buzzing by now. Telephone lines strained, posture-perfect men suddenly trying to look human. I imagined him there, tie slanted, voice tight, hunting for a name. Good. The thought was not triumphant so much as precise, that particular satisfaction of seeing a plan begin to work. By mid-morning my anonymous account had a reply. We're looking into it. A small red flag in my inbox. But to me it was the first proof. The world had a way of answering when the right pebble was dropped in the right pond. Marcus panicked. Emails flew like paper birds. Reputations quivered. Ron's text came terse. He's freaking out. What did you do? My thumb hovered over the reply and then rested. Not yet. Timing is as crucial as the act. You jab the wound at the right moment, not the first. The radio kept whispering. Regulators, audits, nervous investors, and I listened like a man eavesdropping on his own fate. Marcus's confidence began to fray in public ways that made private things unravel. Claire, meanwhile, kept arranging her life in carefully filtered images, a gloss of invulnerability. Her Instagram smiled. The creditors did not. I pulled the notebook back into the light and drew a new arrow from Marcus to Claire. Exposure. She had built herself on appearances, curated photographs, name-brand goods, an itinerary of weekends that cost more than she could afford. If Marcus's stoic world started to crack under regulatory pressure, the leaks would ripple outward, and those with unpaid credit cards notice things that polite friends did not. I would not burn them in spectacle. I would turn up the pressure until the scaffolding they'd built to hide their hollowness creaked and then gave. There was a thrill in the math of it. For every rumor I seeded, for every whisper I coaxed into being, a new set of consequences would follow. Phone calls from collections, awkward meetings with bank managers, a boss who suddenly became litigious, small precise discomforts, not ruin, but enough to make the two of them feel what Evelyn had felt, the empty space of abandonment, the sharp knowledge that the people they'd relied upon could be gone when convenience beckoned. That evening I sat at the kitchen table while the city outside settled into the blue of dusk. The notebook lay open by the lamp, arrows and names like the skeleton of a machine. I thought of Evelyn again, her laugh threaded through the photograph albums, her small hands folded in mine, and felt both the weight of sorrow and the cool clarity of purpose. We had loved them, they had given that love back in coin and convenience. Now I would teach them the vocabulary of cost. I locked the drawer, slid the photograph album in beside the notebook, and stood by the window. The skyline was a scatter of lights. Somewhere in one of those towers my son and daughter were pacing, worried and preening and frantic. They had not come to Evelyn's bedside when it mattered. They would come to know the ache of absence in other forms. I turned from the window, felt the ring warm a little against my leg, and began to plan the next steps, small, steady, inevitable. Henry. Eric's paranoid. Laura's a mess. I wrote the words in the margin of the notebook like a verdict, slow and deliberate. Eric, panic. Laura, facade crumbling. The pen scratched, and with every line my pulse steadied. It was as if naming them made their faults more real, more actionable. I pictured Laura's apartment before I went after her. A room perfumed with a jasmine that tried to mask disorder. Dresses slung over the couch like discarded promises. Wine glasses half-finished and forgotten. The sort of chaos someone might mistake for a life lived fast. When Eric arrived, he slammed the door, a thunderclap of anger and fear. He checked the locks twice like a man who'd learned to be suspicious of everything. "If you hadn't been so careless," she hissed at him, voice high and sharp, as if anger could scrub away the worry, "we wouldn't be in this." "Careless?" He spat back and tore a page from a notepad, crumpling it into a fist. "You're bleeding money, Laura. This is on you." Their voices collided in the hallway like two trains, each refusing to yield. It was the same argument I'd broken up a dozen times when they were kids. Toys, scraped knees, whose turn it was. Back then I'd smoothed the edges, patched things together with sandwiches and jokes. Now I sat miles away watching the same fight in a different register, and it fed the hard thing growing in me. Betrayal turned to method. Emily's ring was a cold coin in my pocket, an honest weight that steadied my hand more than my heart. I sat in the cafe with the notebook open, and scrolled through their profiles like a man reading classified reports. Laura's posts had the laugh, the parties, the curated glamour, captions that pretended everything was fine. Behind the filters, the comments and the unpaid invoices whispered a different truth. Eric had gone quiet, the kind of silence men adopt when the tides come in and they cannot swim. I called Ron. "What's the latest?" I asked, keeping my voice flat as ice glass. He let out a small, humorless laugh. "They're imploding," he said. "Laura's dodging calls, Eric's yelling at staff. You got them good." His words landed with a grim satisfaction that made a small, cold smile cross my face. Good was not the right word. Precise was. Each small unraveling was an instrument, tuned to the pitch of their indifference. When evening came, I walked until the city pressed its ordinary noise around me. The pavement glinted with rain. Shop windows reflected a world that would not pause for personal calamity. One window held a hairline crack that flashed like a promise, a tiny flaw that became the motif of my revenge. Back in Ron's office, the smell of stale smoke and paper palmed the room. A brass clock beat time on the shelf, counting down an invisible ledger. Ron slid a folder across the desk, a stack of documents, account statements, little chits of evidence. 3 missed payments, he said, and tapped the paper. Creditors circling. She's underwater. His smirk had the certainty of a man who's watched too many facades collapse. "Can we use this?" I asked, pen hovering like a surgeon's scalpel. "If you want humiliation, yeah," Ron said, blunt as a hammer. "Tip off creditors anonymously. Let them swarm. Small pressure balloons. They pop and everyone sees the hole." He made it sound like a science. I liked that. Science is predictable. People are messy. That night at the public library, where the air always smelled faintly of dust and things preserved, I buried myself in law books and case notes. The librarians glanced up from their carts and the tables rustled with pages I'd never read for pleasure. I pulled up statutes about debt collection, notes on public notices, the mechanical cruelty of legal timelines. There were precise ways to nudge a creditor into action. The right phrase on a letter, the right form filed, an anonymous complaint that makes a collection agency perk its ears. I filled pages with tactics, careful not to cross lines I could never walk back from. The library's reading lamp threw a small cone of light over my work. Outside, the city kept moving, oblivious. At home, the house was a silhouette of the life Emily had kept. Quilts folded, chairs aligned, everything like a small shrine. I sat at the kitchen table with a blank envelope and my pen. For a moment the question rose, could I do this? Could I take a child's life of ease and turn it into the anxious scramble my wife had faced alone? I thought of Emily 5 years earlier, painting her cheeks with me as a silly puppet to make Claire laugh. I saw her holding Laura's sticky little hand at a park, teaching her how to tie a ribbon. The throat tightened. Was this what Emily would want? I closed my eyes and the image that came back was of her in the hospital, small and trusting, believing I'd told her the kids had sent their love. She had been denied the truth, and far worse, denied their presence. I breathed out the doubt. I wrote the letter to Laura's creditors with a hand that did not shake. I listed missed payments, named cards, sketched an outline of her liabilities. I used facts Ron had given me, and added details Susan had whispered. Each sentence felt surgical. Each paragraph tightened the noose. When I sealed the envelope, the flap made a small final sound that felt like a lock clicking. I checked the locks on the front door before I left, because ritual comforts the mind as much as it secures the house. The mailbox at the corner was a black silhouette under a street lamp. The slot swallowed the letter with a hollow sound that stuck in my chest. It was done. I didn't have long to wait. Later that night, in the blue-lit chaos of Laura's apartment, the mirror shattered, a high, brittle snap, the glass exploding under the weight of a tray of crystals she'd knocked off in a panic, and it lay like 1,000 moth wings catching the light. She stood over the shards, a hand trembling around the creditor's letter, its bolded demands stark as a guillotine sentence. Her mascara streaked, her face raw in the reflection. For a moment she stared at herself as though she were someone she'd hired to play her role, and the role had slipped. Glass crunched beneath her heel when she stumbled. Dresses lay in ruin, wine dark on the rug. The apartment that had been an image was now a set left unguarded, and the facade fell with a sound I would later liken to silence before a storm. She called and texted, to friends, to her bank, to Eric, the words a frantic litany of pleading. They pushed into voicemail and then into live lines where people politely promised callbacks they never intended to keep. On the other end of one of those calls, Eric paced his office like a caged animal. He had the ferocity and the fear of a man used to controlling outcomes but alien to being outmaneuvered. "2. You put us in this," he barked into the phone, voice raw with accusation. His staff muttered, the crack in confidence growing like a stain. He lashed out at the people he could find, a junior analyst, a receptionist, because anger is a poor map for responsibility. He blamed, because blaming is easier than looking at the hole his choices had made. I sat far away, on a bench in the park where the night air smelled of wet asphalt and cut grass. I watched my phone as the texts streamed in from Ron and Tom. They're panicked. Laura's creditors are calling. A square of satisfaction warmed my chest like a small honest ember, but it was not glee. It was a grim accounting. Each panic, each sleepless night, each humiliation was a ledger balancing at last. When I folded the notebook closed, the arrow from Eric to Laura thickened to a bold line. The machine I was building was not instantaneous. It was a slow, relentless grind, but it worked.
The first pieces had fallen. They woke to a world that no longer smoothed over their absences. The consequences had started to arrive at their doors, and the questions they'd refused to answer had begun, inevitably, to ask for answers back.
The phone's click still echoed in my ears. Eric's broken plea severed mid-word, leaving the silence of the house to settle like dust. I sat in the dim living room, the lamp casting a weak cone of light across Emily's ring on the table. My fingers traced its worn curve, the band warm from my touch, her voice flickering in memory. "Take care of them, Henry." I closed my eyes, and for a moment her face was there, the hospital shadows behind her, her trust burning soft as a candle. Then came the knock, sharp, hollow, pulling me back. When I opened the door, the night air pressed in, cool and damp. Eric and Laura stood there, stripped of the gloss they'd always worn. His tie hung loose, his suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. Laura's scarf was twisted, her makeup blurred in dark streaks. The arrogance, the distance, the judgment, it was gone. What remained was only fear, only ruin. "Dad," Eric began, his voice raw, the edge gone. "I lost my job. They fired me after the audit. The firm," he faltered, swallowing hard. "It's gone." Laura stepped forward, her hands twisting at her sides, her voice trembling. "They're taking my apartment. I can't stop them. The debts, they're—" She broke, a sob scraping out. "We're sorry, Dad, for everything, for Mom. We should have been there." I studied them, shadows of the children Emily and I had raised. I remembered her funeral, the empty chairs where they should have stood, the rain sliding down polished black stone. I remembered Emily's voice, thin with pain, asking if they'd called, if they were coming. I remembered the silence. "You left her to die alone," I said, each word steady, weighted. Eric flinched as if struck. Laura shook her head, tears spilling, her hand reaching out to me. "We were wrong. We were selfish. Please, Dad, we're family." The word burned. Family. Once it meant warmth, unity, a promise. Now it was a hollow thing, broken by their choices. My hand tightened on the doorframe. "You had a family," I said, my voice low, final, "and you threw it away." Laura's hand hovered in the air, trembling. Eric's shoulders sagged, his face drawn in defeat. For a heartbeat, I almost saw my children again, the ones who laughed in the backyard, who held Emily's hands at the table. But that was gone, buried with her. I shut the door. Their muffled voices carried through for a moment, then faded into the night. My chest ached, but I did not waver. They would taste what they had dealt. Abandonment, silence, loss. The next morning, the world moved on. Downtown, in a crowded cafe, the hiss of steam and clatter of cups filled the air. Ron slid into the booth across from me, a folder thick with papers in his hand. His grin was sharp. "You've got them on their knees," he said, tapping the folder. "But we can take it further. File suit. Demand repayment. Every cent you ever gave them. College, cars, Laura's wedding. It's legal. It'll crush them." I sipped my coffee, the bitterness settling heavy on my tongue, grounding me. My hand pressed against my pocket, the ring warm against my thigh, Emily's memory like a whisper at my ear. "Take care of them." I lifted the pen, steady now, and signed, "Do it." Ron nodded, satisfied, sliding the folder back. "Court tomorrow. Be ready." I didn't answer. My gaze was on the window, the city's chaos beyond the glass. People hurried by, unaware of the reckoning being written in ink and silence. That night, the house was quiet again, the shadows deep, the air thick with the weight of what was coming. My phone buzzed once. Ron's message, curt and certain. "Lawsuit filed. Court tomorrow." I stood by the window, the glass cool beneath my palm. Outside, a single street lamp flickered, its light sputtering against the dark. "This is for you, Emily," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. The ring pressed against my palm as I closed my fist. Justice wasn't sweet. It wasn't light. It was heavy, final, unflinching, and it was mine.